Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about Reformation politics. Yesterday we talked about Reformation religion and how the Reformation changed the doctrine of the Catholic Church going forward. Today we're going to talk about how the Reformation impacted the politics of the age. And like Lady Anne Boleyn advises you on this first screen, you're going to want to buckle up because there is some tea about to be spilled. So you guys remember the Borgias and the Medicis from our Renaissance unit? These guys are so much more insane. The Tudor family ruled England from 1485 to 1603, starting with Henry VII, the last king of England to win his throne on the battlefield, the traditional way. The symbol in the center is the Tudor rose with the family symbol, and this family produced Henry VIII. I'm sure you recognize him, or at least his portrait. He was a pretty big cheese in England and still is when you're talking about English rulers. So Henry was King of England from 1509 to 1547, and he was most famous for being married 6 times throughout his life. He ended up with 3 children who lived long enough to inherit the throne, and he employed our friend Sir Thomas More, who I'm sure you also recall from our Renaissance unit. And Henry basically executed anyone who got in his way, which is going to be a pattern as we go forward. So all of this starts with Henry's choice to get a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was the cousin of Charles V. You know Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor of the empire on which the sun never sets, the king of England, Spain, and the guy who had 1,000 jobs. Yeah, he was one of the most powerful people in the world. She's his cousin. So she actually married Henry's brother Arthur first, but Arthur died, possibly of sweating sickness, and she married Henry with papal authority, because in the Bible it says that a man shall not marry his brother's widow, so a special allowance had to be made. Catherine was well-educated, an old-school feminist, and friends with Erasmus and Thomas More. She was kind of awesome for the age, honestly. Some of her writings are really inspiring to women of the age. And as I put in her little bubble there, Thomas Cromwell once said of her, if not for her sex, she could have defied all the heroes of history, which for the time, that's a pretty great compliment. But even through 6 pregnancies, only 1 child survived, a girl. Ah, boo. No, can't have that. Ah, no. So Henry decided to marry Anne Boleyn, Catherine's maid of honor, her highest-ranking maid in her retinue. Anne's sister, Mary, had already been Henry's mistress for quite a while, but Anne was very attractive. She was a Protestant and very well educated. She had a fiery, spitfire attitude that was seen as very attractive. She was well-spoken, well-written, and just a very likable person overall, by most accounts. But the Pope was like, I don't care how cool she is, and he refused Henry's divorce to Catherine. So Henry decided he didn't need the church anymore. So it was a bad time to be Pope. And so England had its own church, the Church of England, and the nation became Protestant. Henry appointed Thomas Cranmer as the Archbishop of the church, but Henry, the monarch of England, was at the top. And of course, because Cranmer had gotten his job that way, he granted the divorce. Now, that's the foundational principle of the Church of England, that the monarch of England is the head of the church. And that exists into the current day. So the current head of the Anglican Church is Queen Elizabeth II, and it has been this way since the church was founded. So now we have Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, and things were looking great when they got married. She gave birth to a healthy daughter, Elizabeth, and then she had 3 more miscarriages, and then her opponents decided she wasn't cool enough to stay at court after all. Her enemies, who thought she was either too frivolous to be queen or too unlikable, too much of a spitfire wit, which was very attractive for a what's the word I'm looking for a mistress, but not for a wife and queen, decided to get rid of her. So they found some crimes to charge her with. They fished around and found adultery, incest, and treason, none of which she had committed, and she was executed in 1536. So then we had Jane Seymour, and Jane was queen consort from 1536 to 1537. You'll notice, if you're paying attention, that that's just 1 year. That's not very long there. And in fact, it was even shorter than that. It was really only a few months. So Jane had been his mistress during Henry's marriage to Anne, which made Anne horribly jealous, which, no duh. Jane was also a maid of Catherine's and then Anne's. So, like I said, seeing a pattern here with where he's finding his ladies. Jane was engaged to Henry the day after Anne's execution and married the same month, which is just, oof, ouch. It doesn't get much worse than that, does it? Well, maybe it does, because she was actually never crowned queen. Jane gave birth to a son, future King Edward VI, in 1537, but died of complications in childbirth. Now, historical accounts suggest that Jane was Henry's favorite wife and perhaps, argued by some historians, the only wife he ever loved. In fact, when Henry VIII died, he was buried next to her, and I believe he had some epitaph written about her at his death. She was really possibly the only queen he ever cared much about, unfortunately. Which is a great way to introduce Anne of Cleves, who was queen consort from January 6th to July 9th, 1540. She was a German princess, and her brother William was a leader of the Protestants of Western Germany, and Henry wanted an alliance. At the time, being Protestant in this continent was going to be very difficult without an allegiance of several different states, and so he wanted to appeal to the German princes who had turned to Protestantism. But apparently, she wasn't pretty enough. That's literally the reason. The whole reason is she wasn't pretty enough. So the marriage was annulled after just 6 months. Thomas Cromwell, who had pushed for the marriage, was executed, but it ended up pretty good for her. Anne was given land and treated as a friend to Henry, and they corresponded for the rest of their lives. They seemed to get along pretty well. He just didn't like to look at her, I guess. Which leads us to Catherine Howard. Catherine was queen consort from 1540 to 1541. That's not looking good for her. She was a teenager when he was 49, so gross. She was alleged to have had an affair with Henry's favorite male courtier, Thomas Culpeper, which may or may not have been true. She did confess upon her hanging when she was executed 3 months later at the age of 21. But a lot of those confessions, like we talked about earlier with witchcraft and other heretical persecution, might have been tortured or convinced out of her. And I want to point out that Catherine Howard was actually the first cousin of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's mother had been a Howard. So it's a pretty narrow pool of young women who he's selecting from. Just think about that. Which leads us to Catherine Parr, Queen of England, queen consort from 1543 to 1547. She and Henry led similar lifestyles, actually. Catherine Parr was married 4 times, and she published the Prayers or Meditations, the first book published by an English queen under her own name. That's pretty cool. Like, that's actually pretty awesome for her to have done that. And she came out of this possibly better than anybody else, with the possible exception of Anne of Cleves, because Henry died in the middle of their marriage in 1547. She remarried 6 months later, as per the pattern, but she herself died in 1548 due to complications of childbirth. She was very advanced in age when she attempted to have another child with this marriage, and it didn't go that well. Her funeral was actually the first Protestant funeral held in English in England, Scotland, and Ireland, which was a big nationalist statement. Previous Protestant funerals had been held exclusively in Latin, as was per tradition, but it's the Anglican Church. We gotta get Anglican about it, so there we go. Which leads us to the question of succession. Henry's dead. Half his wives are dead. Who's going to take over? So Henry's only son, only legitimate son, Edward VI, was only 9 when Henry died, leaving him the throne. So a regency council governed England until he reached maturity. At least that was the plan, but he died before that could happen at age 15. Not a happy, healthy family. Edward tried to keep England Protestant with his rule and tried to keep his sisters from taking the throne by appointing his own heir, who he knew would keep England Catholic, or Protestant, which was Lady Jane Grey. Also known as the 9 Days Queen, again, that doesn't sound very good for her. Jane was the Queen of England from July 10th to July 19th of 1553. Jane was a committed Protestant supporting the Church of England. But her supporters and advisors on Jane's side switched sides pretty quickly and supported Mary instead, when it was clear that Jane didn't have a lot of support from the common ministers. Jane and her husband were executed in 1554 for high treason after Mary had already taken the throne. Poor girl. Which leads us to Queen Mary. Queen Mary I ruled from July 1553 until her death in 1558. Still not a very long rule, but it does beat Jane's. Mary was very Catholic. Remember that she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a very Spanish princess, and so she tried to turn England back to Catholicism. During her reign, she had over 280 religious dissenters burned at the stake, so Protestants called her Bloody Mary, a lovely nickname. Mary married Philip II of Spain in 1554, but unfortunately died childless after many fruitless attempts. And then there was Elizabeth I, possibly the best known Queen of England, besides the Queen we have now, and possibly Queen Victoria. So Elizabeth was the Queen of England from 1558 until her death in 1603. She was the last monarch of the House of Tudor, as she had no children of her own. Elizabeth reversed Mary's Catholic policies and restored Protestantism to England. She never married. As we said before, she had no heirs. She never married, which earned her the nickname the Virgin Queen. The state of Virginia is named for her, and anytime you hear Virginia, the Virgin Queen, it was likely named for Queen Elizabeth. She was a patron of the arts and strategist of war against Spain. You'll remember from the Renaissance unit, she was one of Shakespeare's most famous patrons, and she helped win the naval war against Spain during her reign, which is a very big deal, especially for a queen. She was very underestimated in this period. Queen Elizabeth's major strength came from the stability she brought to England after 9-day queens and 9-year-olds who only ruled under a privy council. She brought a stability of a 40-year reign that really helped England to get back on its feet and establish a national and a religious identity to carry them through to the next period. And that's the tea. Okay, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about the effects the Reformation had on Europe as a whole and the consequences that came out of it. So thank you so much for listening. Have a great evening, and don't kill your wife. I'm sorry, that was a bad ending.